The year 2025 offered Arthur Vane, at 78, a retirement of quiet, gilded solitude, a reward, perhaps, for a lifetime spent mastering the impenetrable language of corporate law. Yet, this solitude was less a prize and more a gilded cage. His apartment, high above the relentless pulse of the city, was all polished walnut, heavy velvet, and the scent of aged leather, a fortress against the untidy truth of the outside world. He was a monument to his own success, and like most monuments, he was cold and still. His emotional state was one of profound, yet meticulously concealed, regret. He moved with the practiced slowness of a man conserving his limited energy, his every action a silent negotiation with his own mortality. He didn't fear death so much as he feared the silence that would follow, a silence that might amplify a mistake made 40 years ago into an eternal shriek. The sound that punctuated his quiet routine was the dull, rhythmic click of his heavy, mahogany cane against the polished marble floor, a sound that, to him, felt like a metronome counting down the final measures of his life. The disruption began not with a bang, but with a sudden, violent thump in his chest that sent him, breathless and pale, to the hospital. "You're not dying of age, Arthur," Dr. Anya Sharma, his sharp-eyed geriatric psychologist, had noted with startling directness a week later. "You're dying of a secret." He had deflected her with a barrister's practiced ease, but the observation was unnerving. The true inciting incident arrived on a wet Thursday. The letter was thick, the envelope brittle and yellowed, its edges softened by what looked like decades of rough handling. It bore a smudged, illegible postmark, hinting at an agonizingly late journey. He recognized the looping, elegant hand immediately. Elias Thorne. Elias, the idealistic engineer Arthur had professionally and ruthlessly outmaneuvered 4 decades ago in a landmark corporate acquisition, a case that had cemented Arthur's reputation and ruined Elias's life. Elias was dead now, had been for years. Arthur carried the letter over to his study, the rich, slightly sweet scent of old paper and dust immediately grounding him. He felt the chill of the paper in his hands, a stark contrast to the oppressive warmth of the room. He slit the envelope with a silver letter opener, his hands, surprisingly, not trembling. The single page inside was written in a hurried scrawl. It was not a plea, but a final, bitter farewell, dated 1985. It spoke not of corporate malfeasance, but of a quiet, essential lie that had been hidden within the case documents, a lie that cost him more than his career. "They took the mine, Arthur, and they took my name, but the real cost was her security. They found the vulnerability I knew was there and weaponized it. I won't let them have the last word. You know the thwack of the seal, don't you? Listen for it. It was never about the ore." The phrase hung in the air, the thwack of the seal. It was the sound of a legal judgment being made irreversible, final. It was the sound of authority being wielded. And Elias, decades ago, was telling him it marked a lie. The letter was not a ghost seeking vengeance. It was a map left for a man who needed a purpose more than he needed peace. Arthur felt a sudden, visceral shift. The dignified melancholy lifted, replaced by a cold, searing clarity of purpose. His retirement was over. He was no longer a man waiting to die. He was a lawyer with a final, desperate case to win. The first action was immediate, fueled by a sharp, guilt-driven adrenaline. He needed to find the collateral damage. He pulled a worn, leather-bound directory from a secure desk drawer, a relic from his time, and, ignoring the rhythmic, distant click of his cane against the floor as he traversed the room, he began to track the family Elias had left behind, starting with the daughter, Alara. Arthur's clarity of purpose acted as a powerful, if temporary, palliative. The sharp, physical pain in his chest that had sent him to the hospital seemed to recede, replaced by the cool, hard logic of the case. He was a barrister again, not an invalid, and the law demanded discretion. His investigation could not appear frantic, lest it tip off the long-retired, but still formidably connected, Senator Graham Hollis. His first attempt to gather information was calculated. He used his upcoming appointment with Dr. Anya Sharma as cover. She, sensing his psychological disquiet, was the perfect unwitting resource. The clinic smelled of clinical sterility and faint lavender, the precise metallic scent contrasting sharply with the warm, rich aroma of the old, dusty legal directories he was still consulting in his head. "You look better than last week, Arthur," Anya observed, her pen hovering over her notepad, less rigid. "I've found a project," Arthur said carefully. "Something to organize. An old, complicated estate matter." He needed access to a public records database that would raise immediate flags if accessed from his home IP, specifically the property and financial records tied to the old acquisition. He feigned confusion about modern digital filing systems, letting his dignified age become a shield. "It's a nightmare, these new systems," he sighed, tapping his cane softly on the carpeted floor. "I need a way to run a few discrete, cross-reference searches on 40-year-old corporate filings without arousing suspicion. A secured proxy, perhaps." Anya, recognizing the meticulous mind beneath the frail facade, misunderstood his request entirely. She saw it as a healthy, intellectual engagement, a diversion from his mortality. She offered him the contact of a trusted, discreet IT consultant who specialized in securing digital archives for complex family trusts. It was precisely the cover he needed. Measured determination had prevailed. With the IT contact secured, Arthur shifted his focus to the collateral damage, Alara. He drove his own sedan, a heavy, dark vehicle, to the neighborhood listed for Alara Thorne. It was a place far removed from the manicured, silent towers of his own life, a street lined with tired homes, the paint peeling, the small yards choked with weeds. The slow, deliberate pace of the drive allowed his disgust to deepen. This poverty was not an abstract social failure. It was a direct consequence of a decision he had signed, sealed, and forgotten. He had been chasing the thwack of the seal, the sound of legal finality, and this street was its echo. He located her house. Alara, now a woman in her 60s, sat on a sun-drenched, rickety porch swing, mending a faded quilt. She was thin, her hair the color of fine ash, and her face held an expression of permanent, internalized trauma of abandonment and injustice. He parked across the street, letting the heavy, familiar smell of old leather from his car seat surround him. He watched her for 20 minutes. She moved with a weary grace, her head bowed over the fabric. The quiet sound of a distant, out-of-tune piano, perhaps a neighbor practicing, filtered through the afternoon air. It was a melody that sounded vaguely familiar, triggering a faint, painful memory of Elias Thorne playing in his own small office decades ago. Arthur felt the last vestiges of his professional detachment crumble. He wasn't tracking an archetype, the child victim/subject, as he had catalogued her. He was watching a woman whose entire life had been defined by his ambition. His guilt hardened into resolute certainty. He was not doing this for his soul. He was doing it because the injustice was tangible, living, and breathed the same air he did. He decided, then and there, that the covert method would be necessary. The IT consultant would be used to find the financial vulnerability that Elias mentioned, the one that had been weaponized. He drove away, the clicking of his cane on the garage floor upon his return sounding heavier, more purposeful than ever before. He was committed to gathering the evidence, no matter the personal cost. Arthur, having secured the IT proxy under the guise of an archival estate audit, descended into the true work of the investigation. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He was using the exact systemic complexity he had helped create decades ago to now dismantle it. The process was slow, deliberate, and intensely boring, a world away from the emotional charge of watching Alara. He sat for hours, framed by the pale glow of his desktop monitor, surrounded by the heavy shadows of his study. He tracked the digital paper trail with the relentless focus of a predator. He was looking for the financial vulnerability Elias Thorne had mentioned, not just a loophole, but a deliberate weaponization. The IT consultant, a young man named Ken, did the technical heavy lifting, sifting through digitized records of the corporate acquisition from 1985. Arthur, meanwhile, used the cross-reference data to pore over the physical documents he still possessed from his old firm's archives, musty, yellowed boxes stored in a climate-controlled basement vault. He needed the sensory confirmation that digital records could not provide. The sensory details of the search became paramount. The smell of old paper and dust, the gritty texture of ancient ink, the satisfying sound of documents being slid from brittle folders. He was burrowing back into a time when his ambition was at its zenith. His heart, the unpredictable engine of his mortality, felt taut and cold as he hunted through the boxes labeled Vane/Hollis, 1985. Thorn acquisition. He found it late one night, deep within a section of documents marked Contingent Geophysical Reports. Elias Thorne had been an engineer obsessed with the precise structural integrity of the mine, and his final report had indicated a critical, foreseeable instability in the mine's deepest shaft, an instability that would make continued extraction profoundly expensive and risky. Arthur found his copy of the report, untouched for 40 years. It had been signed off as risk-assessed and mitigated by a junior member of the acquisition team. But then, tucked behind a series of redundant environmental waivers, he found the original, unmitigated copy of Elias's final geological assessment. It contained a hand-drawn sketch detailing the flaw. Crucially, the final signature page was duplicated, but the original was visibly different. He held the page up to his desk lamp. In the soft light, he saw it. The initialed sign-off confirming the report's acceptance had been overlaid with a clear, heavy ink. It was a forgery, a simple, elegant piece of professional corruption. Beneath the fake signature, a tiny, almost invisible impression, the senator's initials, GH, written in faint graphite. The fraud wasn't that they ignored the vulnerability. The fraud was that they had denied it existed and had sacrificed Elias Thorne's reputation to seal the denial. It was Graham Hollis's direct, malicious intervention. The discovery was not accompanied by shouted anger, but by a sudden, devastating silence. The truth was not a theory anymore. It was cold ink on old paper. The sight of Hollis's faint initials was the exact irreversible moment the prompt demanded. The relief of confirmation was immediately supplanted by the crushing, visceral realization that his career, his perfect law, had been built not on genius, but on a foundation of malice. The guilt, held in check by the thrill of the chase, returned with overwhelming force. Arthur gasped, a sudden, ragged sound in the silent apartment. He didn't drop the paper, he clutched it. His chest seized with a violent, familiar thump, not the minor flutter from weeks ago, but a profound, debilitating clench. The cane clattered loudly to the floor. He slid from his chair, hitting the polished marble floor. He was no longer a lawyer. He was a terrified, old man, drowning in the truth of his own making. Lying on the cold floor, beneath the heavy scent of his old leather books, the last coherent thought that echoed in his mind was, "Hollis knew I would never check." He was utterly, physically vulnerable, the forged document clutched in his hand. The truth was revealed, but the consequences had already begun. Arthur woke on the cool marble floor, the scent of antiseptic and panic clinging to him. He was back in his apartment, Dr. Anya Sharma kneeling beside him, administering oxygen. His son, Marcus, stood stiffly in the doorway, his face a mask of weary disapproval. The forged document, miraculously, was still clutched in his hand. It was a severe vasovagal syncope, Arthur, Anya stated, her voice taut with medical authority. A stress response. You need the hospital. No. Arthur rasped, his voice raw. He forced himself upright, ignoring the dull, rhythmic ache in his chest. I need a phone call. Marcus stepped forward, his tone sharp. This is the end, Dad. You need to give up this ridiculous project before it actually kills you. You're lucid enough for that, aren't you? Arthur ignored his son, his gaze fixed on the paper. He knew Marcus saw only a senile delusion. He needed to move quickly before the evidence was mistaken for trash. His first action was to secure the critical context, a controlled, venomous confrontation with Senator Graham Hollis. He called Hollis's private line. The senator answered with his characteristic, smooth geniality. Arthur, you old lion, heard you had a scare. Are you finally learning to rest? I found it, Graham, Arthur whispered, his tone cutting through the pleasantries like surgical steel. The geological report. I found the forgery, the initialed copy. Silence stretched for a long, heavy moment, broken only by the distant, rhythmic click of Arthur's cane as he pushed himself up fully from the floor. When Hollis finally spoke, the smooth facade was gone, replaced by a cold, dry malice. Arthur, you've always chased ghosts. Put the paper down. It's worthless. You have no credibility, and you have no witnesses. It's the truth, Arthur countered, desperation coloring his voice. The truth is whatever survives, Arthur. You want to talk about ruin? Fine. I see your son, Marcus, is on track for that federal judgeship. A perfect, clean trajectory. I have friends, Arthur. Very powerful friends who believe that associating with a man who suffers from delusions of persecution might suggest a certain lack of judgment in his offspring. A lack of integrity, perhaps. The words were a calculated, brutal strike. Hollis's final threat. You worry about your monument, Arthur. I worry about your son's livelihood. The confrontation was fast and frantic, ending not with a physical fight, but with the utter devastation of Arthur's emotional security. He hung up, sweating, the paper trembling in his hand. He had achieved his goal, confirming Hollis's guilt, but had paid the price of Marcus's future. Marcus, who had been listening from the door, looked pale. What did he mean? What are you doing, Dad? Arthur, utterly defeated, could only stare at his son's terrified face. He had alienated the one person he was trying to protect. He turned to Anya Sharma, who had witnessed the entire exchange with professional detachment that was rapidly fraying into concern. She had treated his heart, but now she was witness to his soul. Dr. Sharma, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a measured and intellectual tone. The law is a weapon, Marcus. I once aimed it poorly. Now, I simply aim for the truth. He then did what he had spent 40 years avoiding. He confessed. He detailed the original case, the professional negligence he had willfully ignored, the thwack of the seal that finalized the lie, and finally, the faint graphite initials on the forged document. He laid out the entire narrative of his ambition, his subsequent guilt, and the living consequence, Alara. Anya listened, no longer a detached professional, but a witness to a lifetime of moral calculus. She saw the profound, desperate anguish of a man choosing to sacrifice his last sliver of reputation to save his integrity. When he finished, the room was silent. She looked at the forged document, then back at Arthur. "I can't offer you legal aid," Anya said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I can offer you logistics, resources, a secure location for that evidence. If you want to face him, you need to be healthy and you need a strategy." Arthur, trembling, nodded. He had secured the crucial alliance. He had confessed his life secret, and in return, he gained not only a logistical partner, but a moral anchor. His greatest vulnerability had resulted in his greatest strength, trust. The final preparations were a study in measured tension. Dr. Anya Sharma, using her clinic's resources and connections, arranged the setting. A quiet press conference scheduled late on a Friday afternoon at a university ethics foundation, ensuring maximum media impact while lending the event an air of solemn academic integrity, not political spectacle. Her involvement lent him the necessary credibility, mitigating the anticipated claims of senility. Arthur, though physically weaker, felt an extraordinary lightness. The decades of guilt, the heavy secret Anya had diagnosed, had been released in the act of confession. His gilded apartment now felt less like a cage and more like a stage for a final, necessary performance. He dressed with meticulous care in a dark suit, the crispness of the fabric a stark contrast to the brittle dryness of his skin. He tried to speak to Marcus again. His son remained aloof, terrified and angry at the potential destruction of his own career prospects. Marcus viewed his father's actions not as redemption, but as a spectacular, egotistical suicide. "This is about you, Dad. Always about your monument." Arthur accepted the silence. He was choosing justice for Elias and Alara over the comfort of his own family, a choice that had been inevitable since the late letter arrived. Anya drove him to the foundation. He carried nothing but his heavy cane, the constant reminder of his decline, and a briefcase containing the original, forged geological report, protected by several layers of documentation. The only sound in the car was the quiet hum of the engine and the faint, nostalgic music Anya had chosen, a piece of classical piano that reminded him, achingly, of Elias Thorne's distant melody. The small hall was packed. The glare of the television lights was blinding, and the air was heavy with expectation. Arthur positioned himself at the podium, placing his hands flat on the polished wood. He ignored the cameras and focused on the silent pact he had made with his own conscience. He began not with a legal argument, but with an apology, a slow, deliberate confession. He described the pressure of the 1985 acquisition, the blinding ambition that led him to prioritize profit over principle, and the deliberate professional distance he maintained to ignore the injustice. For 40 years, he stated, his voice clear but raspy, I believed my silence was a form of dignity. In truth, it was cowardice. I watched a good man, Elias Thorne, lose his name, his livelihood, and eventually his life, all while I built a towering career on the foundation of that very destruction. He then held up the evidence. The room's tempo accelerated, the camera shutters clicking wildly, a sound far more frantic than the gentle thwack of the seal he had remembered. He meticulously detailed the forgery, reading the expert analysis that proved Senator Graham Hollis's direct, malicious intervention. He used the law's own language against him, systematically dismantling the reputation of the man who had been his rival and accomplice. The evidence is here, Arthur concluded, laying the documents on the podium. This is not a mistake of legal interpretation. This is fraud. And the true cost of this deception is not financial. It is the life of his daughter, Alara, who has lived decades in the shadow of this injustice. He looked directly into the camera, aiming his words not at the legal body or the public, but at the essence of professional ethics. I offer this truth to the court of public integrity. I do so knowing that my own reputation, my perfect legacy, dies here today. But the law, ladies and gentlemen, demands justice, even when administered by the unworthy. His final act was to present his full, documented confession, detailing the corporate misdeeds and Hollis's culpability, to a waiting representative from the State Ethics Commission who stood by the stage. The event was instantaneous and irreversible. The immediate outcome was explosive. The public shock was profound. Before Arthur was even escorted from the room by Anya, the news tickers flashed with breaking reports. Senator Graham Hollis, facing overwhelming evidence and the destruction of his credibility, had abruptly resigned all posts and was facing an imminent investigation. The downfall of the antagonist was complete. Arthur leaned heavily on Anya as they left the glare, his heart aching, but his soul finally, profoundly quiet. His monument was rubble, but the truth stood firm. The silence that followed the televised confession was vast, heavier than the decades of guilt Arthur had carried. His health, which had rallied under the adrenaline of the chase, now succumbed to the finality of the act. He was not immediately dying, but he was resting utterly and profoundly in his gilded apartment, which now felt less like a fortress and more like a quiet harbor. Senator Hollis was a ghost. The swiftness of his downfall, the resignations, the investigations, the public outcry, was testimony to the power of Arthur's meticulously documented truth. The quiet, true conclusion, however, lay not in the court of law, but in the court of conscience. 2 weeks after the conference, Anya Sharma drove Arthur to Alara Thorne's modest, weary home. The meeting had been arranged with cautious delicacy, Alara agreed only on the condition of absolute privacy. Arthur navigated the cracked walkway with the aid of his cane, the click on the uneven pavement sounding less like a metronome counting down time and more like a steady, final beat. Alara met him at the porch, her face aged by injustice, but now holding a flicker of guarded expectation. He sat beside her on the rickety swing, the same one he had watched from his car. The air smelled of damp earth and late-season chrysanthemums. "I didn't come here to offer you money," Arthur began, his voice barely a breath. "That will come, and it will be deserved. I came to give you the truth your father died trying to protect." He didn't need to show her the forgery. He simply told her the whole story, the denial, the ambition, the malicious seal. He described her father, Elias, with genuine respect, detailing his brilliance and his idealism. Alara listened, tears finally beginning to track paths through the lines of enduring trauma on her face. It wasn't the material compensation she cared for. It was the quiet, profound act of her father's name being cleared that shattered her composure. "Thank you, Arthur," she whispered, her voice rough. "Now I can finally remember him without the shame." The meeting was brief, profound, and non-legal. It was the simple, essential act of restoration that Arthur had sought. He had found his peace not in acquittal, but in acceptance.